This is Law Bites, a podcast with Michael Geist.
He will not quit. He must be fired. And the person to do it is Jagmeet Singh. Break the costly coalition with Trudeau to trigger a carbon tax election.
You're not going to see Justin Trudeau or Pierre Poilievre on a picket line, but you'll always see me and Alexandre and New Democrats in solidarity with you. We were founded by workers and unions. We will always stand in solidarity with you.
I'm fairly confident that that agreement is a good agreement, it's a strong agreement, and we'll get to the end of June.
We're still a year plus away from the election. I'm focused on making sure we're delivering through that election the kinds of things that Canadians need.
Parliament resumes after a summer break this week. While digital policies receded into the background over the last few months, the political intrigue of by-elections and a minority government without an NDP deal will be accompanied by questions about what happens to Bill C-63, Canada's online harms bill, Bill C-27, the Privacy and AI Reform Bill, Bill S-210, the Age Verification Bill, and a myriad of other regulatory and policy issues. Here to provide a preview of the months ahead is Matt Hatfield, Executive Director of Open Media, one of Canada's leading digital rights organizations. It's engaged on all of these issues, and Matt breaks down where things stand and what other digital policies may command attention. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
There's certainly been a fair share of political drama over the summer, the political deal between the Liberals and the NDP unraveling. There are by-elections that are going to run also the day that this podcast drops. Some politicians are moving on. Some have moved on already. Some are reported to be doing so, including former Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez. And certainly, judging by the headlines, there are no shortage of plans for non-confidence votes in an attempt to trigger an election sooner rather than later. But in amongst all of that politics, there's obviously quite a lot of digital policy as well. And I'm glad that you've joined to help unpack some of the biggest issues. I think it's fair to say, perhaps at the very top of the list, certainly in terms of what I think is likely to get attention this fall, is Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act. People who listen to this podcast will be familiar with the bill. There's been a lot of episodes that have tried to unpack some of its various elements. But for those that took a break from thinking about these issues over the summer, can you provide a quick summary of the bill, and then even more, where are things right now?
Yeah, so it's a four-part bill. Part one is the Online Harms Act itself, which establishes the new Digital Safety Commission. And to our mind, is sort of the real heart of the bill. But it's sort of been stapled onto part two and part three, which is where most of the controversy has been so far. For part two, there's changes to Canada's criminal code that many people have concerns about. And for part three, there's changes to the Human Rights Act that reenacts a version of Section 13. And many people either don't want Section 13 back or are worried about the ways in which it's bringing it back. So C-63 will likely hit committee. My guess would be in October at some point. And it's probably going to go to justice. And that's where people will really start hashing out, what needs to change in this bill. And perhaps the government themselves will bring some changes.
Okay, so speaking of which, in terms of potential changes, there have been some reports that the Justice Minister, Arif Virani, is open to some changes in the hope of getting this bill moving ahead. What have been some of the primary concerns? You highlighted at least a couple there with that intro, but what have been some of the primary concerns with this bill, and where does Open Media stand on it?
So I think it's really good news that he's signaling openness to changes. We're just not sure if his changes will go far enough. So on day one of responding to C-63, Open Media was relatively positive on the bill. And that was because we were very focused on the changes in part one, the Online Safety Act itself. And as compared to what the government had proposed much earlier, around 2021, that portion of the bill is much, much better. And there's some intelligent decisions, I think, made there about how to regulate the internet and where it is most safe to regulate the internet. As time has gone on and people have had more opportunity to digest part two and part three, that's really where a lot of concern has come out. So there's some pretty wild ideas in our view in part two and part three. In part two, we have recognizance provisions, sort of this idea that if the Attorney General and a judge think you might be likely to speak hate speech, they can preemptively apply some pretty punitive life conditions to you to limit your ability to do so. And that's not really something that I know that any normal democracy has done. Certainly, it's not normal in Canada. And so we're hoping and advocating for that to be struck. And then in part three, in terms of how they're reintroducing Section 13, some people have wanted Section 13 to come back for some time. But I think because they were worried it was hard for victims to use it before, they've really set it up to be very, very biased towards someone making a complaint and against someone who's the subject of the complaint in ways that I think are just fundamentally unbalanced and should be fixed or changed if they are bringing back Section 13.
Okay. And those issues certainly have been controversial. And actually, just before we started recording this, day before we started recording this, Conservative MP Michelle Rempel Garner put forward the outline of what is apparently going to be a conservative proposal to deal with online harms. It's their own bill, but it seeks to remove some of those more contentious provisions and takes a somewhat different approach on some of these issues. So it's possible we'll see at least a couple of competing proposals, but of course it's the online harms bill itself, C-63, that is going to be at the heart of some of these issues. The other major piece of legislation that has been circulating around now for even longer than C-63 is C-27, which involves both privacy and AI reform. It was already the subject of extensive hearings. So you mentioned that C-63 will just be starting down that process. In the case of C-27, it's already conducted a fair amount from a hearing perspective last fall into the winter, and then began to move into clause by clause. Can you talk a bit about that bill and where it stands?
So a lot of people seem to be thinking that it may not pass at this point. We don't know how long this parliament will last, given the end of the NDP Liberal deal. I think it would be a shame if the privacy portion of C-27 didn't pass. Canadians have been waiting for more than a decade now since the last reform to our privacy laws. Obviously, the threats to privacy are much different and much worse today than they were in the past. And I think what's really disappointing is, well, good news and bad news. The good news is parliamentarians on committee studying C-27 have really done some excellent work proposing and trying to pass amendments to strengthen the privacy portion of the bill. So both MPs from the NDP and from the Conservatives have pushed some really strong amendments that civil society largely supported. Unfortunately, the government has not taken this well. My sense is they no longer feel like they have control over the process, and they seem to be losing interest in getting the bill done as a result.
So your read is that as the amendments go deeper and deeper into the bill, the government's interest in passing what becomes a somewhat different bill from what they initially envisioned begins to wane.
Yes, I think that's right. I think very often the government is interested in doing a few things that sound good to the general public, and then a lot of things that are beneficial to the industry folk that are lobbying them. And I think that's sort of how C-27 on both the privacy and AI side was initially sized up for. And I mean, credit to them. I think opposition politicians have really pushed the privacy sides to be better and stronger. They haven't yet gotten to clause by clause on the AI side, but I think they would be doing the same there. And the government is just no longer feeling like it's necessarily the win that they expected or wanted.
Okay, so that's interesting. So I just want to make clear, at least in terms from a timing perspective, you mentioned that there are all these extensive amendments that have been put forward. Some have been passed through that clause by clause review on the privacy side of the bill, but AI is still yet to come.
That's right. They haven't started line by lining amendments for the AI side. And I think that's part of why, given how long privacy is taking, people are speculating it may not happen at all, which would be a real shame. We have said in the past it would be better for them to separate these two sides of the bill. There's really no inherent connection or a very weak inherent connection between privacy regulation and AI regulation. And we'd just like to see them separate and get privacy reform done now, and then maybe perhaps take longer to get AI regulation right.
Okay. I mean, those structural issues on this bill sound somewhat reminiscent of some of the structural issues you highlighted a few moments ago on C-63, with elements of criminal law and Human Rights Commission provisions inserted alongside some of the other provisions that deal more specifically with the role of some of the internet platforms. Do we put both of these bills in that same bucket of this attempt to bring in sort of a broader range of different issues has in some ways been some of its undoing, with both of those bills, struggling to progress significantly through the House of Commons, especially with now a potential election call looming as somewhat more likely than it was even just a few weeks ago before the deal between the government and the NDP collapsed?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in both cases, the government has maybe decided we're going to take some pretty uncontroversial things that would clearly most people would support and would be better for Canadians across the board, and has packaged that with some more controversial portions that need more debate or maybe need to be removed. And it's a bit frustrating because it means that in both cases we may get absolutely nothing, including these fairly uncontroversial improvements.
Now, the bill that's the furthest along, unlike both C63 and C27, that are both, as you described, at different stages of the committee process. And I guess we should just, as an aside, note that this is still just the first half. This is just the House. This hadn't got through the House, obviously. Would still be a Senate to come and a similar kind of Senate review if we got to that point. But the bill that sort of has gone through just about all of those processes is Bill S210. It's the age verification and pornography website blocking bill. Where does it stand? Because I know that it did start in the Senate, has passed there, and has been working its way through the House.
Yeah, so it is just one final House vote from becoming the law in Canada. And it was our understanding before the break over the summer that it was very close from getting that vote and just being done. That's despite the fact that committee heard only one day of witnesses. They didn't really hear from any civil society groups, and no amendments were made to it during that brief committee process. So I hope that it is not going to pass in the way that it is currently designed. We were sending some very alarmed messages to both MPs and our community before break because it is very, very detrimental and damaging as it's currently designed. Um, a lot of this problematic internet legislation that we're concerned about has come from the governing Liberal Party, but I should be clear, they're not the ones behind this. They oppose this bill. It's a personal project of Senator Miville Deschênes, who I know you've had on this podcast, but it's the Conservative Party who have championed it the most and helped it get through Senate. And unfortunately, I think the other opposition parties, the Bloc and the NDP, just kind of heard "Let's protect kids" and didn't think very deeply about it and voted for it at the last couple stages. And it just needs more than that if it's going to become law.
Yeah. You have any read on how those opposition parties might fall on this? And certainly, as you mentioned, the governing Liberals have been against it, but so far the opposition parties have have that various degrees of enthusiasm for it, but all so far seemingly willing to send it along.
Yeah, my understanding is some MPs from several opposition parties spent some of the summer talking more with stakeholders and trying to understand the issues better. Literally, in the one day of study committee got, there was an MP saying, "Oh, I'm just starting to understand why there's some concerns here better," and yet no further days of study were called after that. Um, I think the scope issue with S210 is so large. So you mentioned that it's a pornography website blocking bill. It's much, much broader than that. As I know you know, it actually scopes in almost the entire internet currently. So things like search, social media, streaming sites, all of those would need to do some kind of age verification of their users, which could have immense consequences for the both the free expression and privacy of Canadians.
Yeah, no, I agree. The bill raises some serious issues. Anyone that's listened to this podcast knows where I stand on this. And one of the things that's going to make this, I think, pretty interesting is that at least at this stage, as you suggest, we've seen some hints from MPs that they have some concerns, and there are some age verification provisions apparently in the Conservative proposal on online harms. Perhaps that provides a mechanism to address in their mind some of these issues, but it's, I think, frankly, still a bit of a mystery as to how this will ultimately play out, even for a bill, which is odd for a bill that is it's such a late stage in terms of its progress. Beyond the legislation that we've been talking about, those three bills are the three that at least sort of immediately in the fall will, I think, get the most amount of attention. The CRTC has been very, very active implementing or working on implementing Bill C11, the internet streaming bill, Bill C18, the news bill, and then also dealing with some measures to address telecom and wireless affordability. There's a few things CRTC related that'd be worth getting into, but you have some thoughts on what they've been doing, especially in terms of seeking to implement the legislation that's already been passed.
Well, I don't know that incredibly active by CRDC standards is necessarily that fast by an ordinary Canadian's perspective. But yes, they have issued a variety of consultations and decisions on a number of these. So on the telecom affordability side, I think the CRTC has been taking some positive moves. You could certainly argue that it's too little, too late. But we've been waiting 8 years to see if they're going to make it actually realistically possible for ISPs to buy access to fiber networks on other folks' networks. And that appears like it's going to happen now. They still haven't set a final rate to make sure that it's actually possible, but the upshot of that hopefully will be that more Canadians will see more companies selling to them in their local community, which should improve both price and service. Um, on C11 and C18, both bills that have passed and that the CRTC has been asked to help implement, they're kind of in a weird spot because I think both bills have been things the Conservatives have promised to kill if they are elected, and they are, it seems quite likely, will be elected based off current polling. So they are moving forward in a world that may never occur. Um, but we have some very important questions that are up for determination still on both bills. And I think on C11, the most important question has been put to last, which is really what is Canadian content and who gets to make it? They really buried, the government buried this first, and then the CRTC has buried it next. But open media's concern all along has been less about what money is being taken from which platform and more about what are we doing in terms of this Canadian cultural production, and is it going to be open and accessible to all Canadians, especially those making for new media, new platforms? Unclear.
Yeah. No, and you're right. I know that there have been some meetings that have taken place by various stakeholders around some of these issues, but having the broader national conversation on these kinds of issues hasn't happened. And the idea that that's the last thing you deal with, as you highlight, is at a minimum odd. And I think it's frankly more than I think is pretty harmful to have put that core issue to the very end and simply say, let's get some money out the door without figuring out precisely what the policy objectives are and what CanCon more broadly means. You mentioned open media's position on this and some of its participation on some of these issues. I also know that the CRTC says that it plans to hold a consultation on public interest participation in its hearings in the coming months. There was a speech that was given recently by CRTC Vice Chair that specifically flagged this as an area of concern or of interest to the Commission. Can you talk a bit about what it's like for an NGO like Open Media to participate in CRTC processes and perhaps highlight some of the barriers or concerns that you've faced along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to tell people that it's easy to work to appear at the CRTC and you should get involved, and I just can't. It's actually quite difficult to be involved with the CRTC, both because the consultations that they launch are really complex and opaque. The questions are very technical. The formats and schedules that they ask you to work through are quite complicated. You have to follow sort of a multi-part process with confusing stages. It's very legalistic, and as you know, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a citizen advocate, and it's hard for me, and even harder for members of our community. And there is, in theory, a cost regime in place that is supposed to cover the costs for participation. It just doesn't work that well. It's the money comes late, quite late, like years after you spend it, in many cases. There's the opportunity for the folk who the money's drawn from industry, and industry actors can contest your costs. So if I put in that I think my team reasonably spent, $10 or $15,000 of our organization's time on something, industry can fight us for that, and maybe we only get $8,000 back. So when you're working on the kind of budget that small citizen-led organizations have, and you do $15,000 or $20,000 of work and you get $7,000 back 2 years later, it's quite financially difficult in addition to the complexity of the task.
Yeah. Okay. So there's challenges from a cost perspective. What's your sense more broadly of how the CRTC factors in your participation, other citizen group type participation, and I will candidly note that my participation in C11, while the fact that the CRTC didn't listen to a whole lot of what I had to say didn't come as a big surprise. The fact that they talked about encouraging the kind of participation that you just mentioned, but at the end of the day, you look at these decisions and it's hard to see where the kind of submissions that come from many of these groups ultimately factor into their decisions. Seems like most of the citations are reserved for the various industry groups.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the CRTC often talks about wanting to involve Canadians more. I don't see much sign that that is true. I don't see them do things to even make their website a reasonable thing for an ordinary person to engage with, let alone actually solicit the views of ordinary Canadians. Now, that gives us a role in the system. Like a big part of our mandate is soliciting the views of a broad spectrum of people in Canada and bringing that to the CRTC. But really, that should be the CRTC's job. And I think the CRTC sees their job very much more as just being a space for different industry and guild stakeholders to come and hash it out, and someone wins in the end. I don't feel like the Canadian public gets a good chance or a fair chance to win in terms of our interests.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Why don't we wrap with this? There have been, speaking of interest in the views of Canadians or other groups, we have seen some other government consultations. There's one that's going to wrap soon on right to repair. There was one took place earlier this year around copyright and generative AI. There's been some of the issues around the digital services tax with escalating trade fights. Is there anything else that you think people ought to be paying attention to over the fall? We've got some of these bills before committees and at the House. We've got the regulatory related issues at the CRTC. Anything else that you think may be falling under the radar screen a little bit that people should be thinking about?
Well, there's always more. So we just solicited comments for the right to repair consultation for our community. We've got over 7,000 people have participated, and we're going to be delivering those comments soon. Um, Beyond that, I mean, the big question of the digital services tax is whether it ends up being the right time to do. Open Media has supported it in the past, and we'd love to see some of that money spent on some of the policy objectives of other digital issues. But we're also looking at this American election coming up, and one of the candidates is extremely protectionist. Neither of them are really free traders necessarily. And there's some fear, I think, that Canada is going to find itself subject to punitive action from the US for applying the DST because we went alone rather than waiting for the OECD to do it as a group. Um, I mean, beyond that, I think the big question is just competition law. So, as folk may know, some really important improvements to Canada's competition laws were passed this year. It's one of the most optimistic, although most narrowly understood stories in Canada for this year. And we're just really hoping that the Competition Bureau is able to and encouraged to take really aggressive action against some of our monopolies because they're really a huge drain on the Canadian economy that we think needs to be addressed, both in telecom and more broadly.
Okay. No, I'm glad you raised that because certainly we've seen some of these cases in the United States. We started to see budding interest here in Canada on that issue. And in many ways, that really undergirds many of the kinds of concerns that have tended to arise. I'm certainly grateful, Matt, for you coming on to break some of that down, and of course for the work that Open Media has been doing on so many of these issues.
It's our great pleasure.
That's the Law Bites podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbites@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBitesPod or Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bites podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.